Hey there, I'm Walt, and I've spent more years on this earth than I care to admit. But let me tell you something quiet's been rattling around in my mind for more than 2 decades. I can still feel the scent of damp hay mixed with motor oil drifting in through the cracked window of our old garage just outside Chicago, back in '96, when the skies turned heavy and the world seemed to shift under my feet. It was a late summer afternoon, and I'd been wiping grease off my hands after fixing old Mrs. Thompson's transmission, humming a tune I'd learned overseas. That melody, soft, almost mournful, drifted through my head every time I closed my eyes. It's funny how a simple tune can unearth a lifetime of memories, like I'm digging through a dusty attic and every box contains a secret that's been waiting to get out. I remember settling into my favorite wooden rocker on the porch, the one that creaked just right, and watching the rain seep into the cracks of the driveway, each drop echoing a question I couldn't shake. Why did Dennis, my own brother, look at me like I was the enemy? At that moment the world felt steady, familiar, and I never dreamed that same world would turn its back on me just a few years later. And you know, if you're hanging on every word, go ahead and tap that like button or drop a comment beneath and subscribe if you're curious to hear more, because it sure helps an old-timer feel like he's still got an audience worth talking to. But let me tell you, this ain't just any tale of sibling rivalry or small-town squabbles. There's a bitter twist in this yarn that stayed heavy on my heart ever since I first woke up behind barred windows and the pungent scent of antiseptic filled my lungs. I'm talking about the day those heavy doors clanged shut behind me, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because my own blood decided my life was worth stealing. I was a mechanic, a vet who believed in honor over profit, a man who'd built a small auto parts shop from the ground up alongside my little brother Dennis. We inherited Pa and Ma's place together, split 60-40, and I always figured that was fair. Dennis had a knack for numbers, sure, but I trusted him like family. Only in '99 that trust cracked wide open when he slipped doctored papers into my file, claiming my memory slipped from the things I'd seen overseas. He made out like I was dangerous, unstable, unfit to make decisions. And before I knew it, I was trapped inside a mental hospital, cut off from letters, visits, hell, I don't think I even saw a newspaper for months. All I had were those walls and the constant drip of fluorescence above. That melody in my head carried me through those long nights, each note reminding me who I was and why I couldn't give up. I'll share more of how I fought through that darkness, how I clawed at the truth until the world heard my voice again. But first, stick with me, because it's a story that'll grip you right here in your gut and leave you wondering who you really know when the masks come off. This memory, this moment, it still stings because it taught me that the worst prison ain't made of steel bars and locked doors. It's when the people you love decide you're better off forgotten. So lean in, friend, because I haven't even gotten to the part where I slipped through their cracks and grabbed hold of my freedom. And if you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted, I guarantee you'll want to stick around till the very end. I was just a scrawny kid with grease under my fingernails and sunshine in my eyes when I first learned what it meant to belong to this world. Back in the early '50s, our little place on the edge of that Chicago suburb smelled of fresh-cut grass, backyard barbecues, and my ma's apple pie cooling on the windowsill. I'd wake up before dawn, tug on my overalls, and wander down the dirt path behind our house, where the morning air felt like a soft promise. Pa would already be out in the garage, tinkering away on old Chevys and Fords, humming that same country tune he'd picked up overseas. Dennis, he was 2 years behind me, always tagging along with a rag in hand, eager to learn. We'd race our bicycles past the corner store and back, skidding on loose gravel, laughing until our knees bruised. Even then, I believed in kindness, thought that a person's word was as solid as the steel under Pa's wrench, and that people would always come through for one another. Sunday dinners were a ritual, Ma's roast, the taste of mashed potatoes with just right, Dad telling stories of the war like they were bedtime fairy tales. I'd sit there, elbows on the table, eyes wide, dreaming that one day I'd build something of my own, something that mattered. By the time I hit 16, I'd already got my hands under the hoods of half a dozen neighbors' cars, earning enough spare parts and a little cash to buy my first toolkit. Life felt generous back then, as though the world was waiting for me to carve out my piece of it. Dennis and I worked side by side, he handling the ledgers while I got my hands dirty, running that little auto shop our parents left us. We'd shut down at 6, grab a soda at Mr. Hernandez's stand, and talk about what we'd do when we struck it big, as if fortune was some train rolling into town that we'd hop onto together. I can still see the golden light of those evenings, hear the distant rumble of expressways beyond the cornfields, feel the breeze rustle through the wind chimes Ma hung on the porch. Back then, I believed a man's honor was his compass, and the only inheritance I really cared about was the trust between kin. Sure, Dennis and I had our squabbles, boys always do, but it never crossed my mind that he'd trick me out of what was rightfully ours, that he'd one day look at me and decide I wasn't to be trusted. I thought family was unbreakable. I thought loyalty was as simple as breathing. I thought that if you planted good seeds, good things would grow. I thought people always returned what they owed. It wasn't until the day Pa's old garage door slammed shut behind me that I realized how naive that belief was. But in this moment, here in that long-ago summer, I was nothing but a hopeful kid, whistling with the crickets as dusk settled in, certain that tomorrow held miracles. I'd tuck in under my quilt, dreaming of engines and road trips in the day Dennis and I would take that shop all the way downtown. Those nights were warm and simple, and I'd never have guessed that beneath all that promise lay a storm that would one day tear our world apart. Yet every time I close my eyes now, I'm right back in that rocking chair on the porch, the scent of Ma's pie still drifting through the screen door, and I can feel the weight of what was lost pressing down on my chest. Because for a moment, I believed in forever. I can still remember the afternoon I first laid eyes on her, Mary Thompson, strolling into the shop with a curious kindness in her gaze, sunlight dancing across her auburn hair as she asked me for a part for her father's old Ford. And I felt a flutter in my chest I hadn't known since I was a boy pretending to be a pilot in the backyard. I remember thinking how odd it was that a simple request for a gasket could feel like a summons to something bigger, something I couldn't quite name yet. My hand shook just enough at Dennis, leaning over the counter, gave me a puzzled look, and I cleared my throat, stalling as I found the right part, praying I wouldn't drop anything. Mary smiled, and it was the kind of smile that could unfreeze winter, and I remember telling her to take her time, that I'd be right back, while Dennis rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath. I followed her outside, toolbox in hand, and she laughed when I tripped over a loose board on the porch, and that sound rattled something loose in my mind. In that moment, the shop felt smaller, the afternoons hotter, and the promise in the summer air felt like a gentle nudge towards something I'd been missing. I couldn't explain it then, but I felt as though I'd been sleepwalking through my own life, and her presence awakened a part of me that I thought was long gone. I glanced back at Dennis standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a tightness around his eyes I didn't quite understand until much later, and I chalked it up to sibling rivalry or some quiet joke between us. But the truth was I was too busy watching Mary's soft profile to pay much mind. She thanked me for fixing the part quickly, winked, and walked off with that tinkling laughter trailing behind her. I stood there, toolbox at my feet, heart pounding, wondering what just happened. That was the day everything changed. That was the day I realized I wanted more than engines and wrenches to define my life. I wanted a future that included someone who saw me as more than the grease under my fingernails. I wanted someone to share Sunday dinners with, someone to laugh with over nothing. I didn't know then that Mary would become my wife, or that our little home on that suburban street would hold so many quiet joys, or that Dennis's sly glance that afternoon would sow a seed of envy that would grow into something darker than I could have ever imagined. I didn't know that her laughter would echo in my mind during the darkest nights behind locked hospital doors, reminding me of the warmth I'd left behind. All I knew was that my world had widened in the span of a heartbeat, that I'd been given a glimpse of what love could be, and that I was going to chase that feeling with everything I had. And looking back now, I realized that encounter, simple as it seemed, was the spark that ignited a chain of events leading me to freedom, betrayal, and ultimately the fight to reclaim the life I thought was mine. Because sometimes a single moment, a single person stepping into your world, is enough to rearrange your entire story. It wasn't just a fleeting afternoon, it was the fulcrum that tipped the scales of my destiny, setting in motion the joys and sorrows that would carve every chapter of the years to come. Life didn't stay sunny and sweet for long. It was early spring of 2000 when the first real storm rolled in, just after Mary had our second boy, and I'd spent all morning stacking tires in the back lot, feeling proud of the little family I'd built. I remember the air turned sharp that afternoon like a warning, and when I rounded the corner of the shop I found Dennis standing at the office door, his face as tight as a drum. He said I needed to come inside, and I shrugged off the wrench in my hand and followed, thinking it was business as usual. But when I pushed through that door, I saw Pa's old ledger lying open on the desk, numbers circled in red, and my stomach twisted. "What's this about?" I asked, but Dennis only stared at me like I'd grown a second head. He cleared his throat, voice low, and told me there had been some irregularities in the accounts. I blinked at him, confused. Irregularities? I've been balancing those books every Friday for years. "I've got a feeling we need to head downtown," he said, jaw clenched. "They want to audit the shop." That word hit me like a punch. Audit. I'd faced down engines that snarled and roared, but an audit felt like stepping into a courtroom in my heart. I tried to laugh it off, but when I checked my voice trembled. I brushed it aside, packed a bag, and headed to the city hall with Dennis at my side, all the while praying it was just a misunderstanding. Only it wasn't. They found inconsistencies. Every single transaction I logged was called into question. My hand shook as I signed papers I didn't understand, while Dennis stood behind me, arms crossed, offering no help. That night I lay awake in our small apartment, staring at the wallpaper peeling in the corner, heart hammering. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I built this business with my hands and my sweat, and now it was crumbling around me. My mind raced. Had I made a mistake? Was I a fool for trusting the numbers I'd kept by hand for so long? I felt shame I couldn't swallow and fear that I'd lose it all. Mary, the boys, the shop, even my own dignity. No one came to comfort me that night. Mary, exhausted from childbirth and juggling two small children, managed a gentle touch on my arm but offered only worried eyes. Dennis, he camped out in his own corner of the apartment, silent as a tomb. I felt more alone than I ever had. The next morning, I went back to the shop determined to set things right, to prove my name still meant something. But when I unlocked the door, the place felt foreign. Parts were missing, invoices torn, and my toolbox lay open on the floor as if someone had searched through it looking for evidence. My blood boiled, and I stormed to the office to find Dennis rifling through my personal files, pulling out letters from friends and vets, muttering about cleanup. I stopped short, voice cracking, and demanded to know what the hell was going on. He looked me in the eye and called me a liability, said I was unstable, that these mistakes in the books were proof I couldn't be trusted with anything. My hand flew to my chest, heart pounding so loud I thought it might leap right out. I remembered every Sunday dinner, every handshake with Ma, every vow I had made to keep this family together, and the betrayal stung deeper than any engine burn or battlefield scar. I confronted him, tried to reason, but he only folded his arms and said it was too late to fix what was broken. That night I stood under the streetlight outside the shop, rain soaking through my jacket, and wondered how the man I'd grown up with could look at me and choose to destroy our life. Inside me, a war broke out between the man who believed in kindness and the man who wanted to lash out in anger. I fought back tears of hurt and a rage so intense it made my hands tremble. I felt shame for even caring what he thought, and fear that this was only the start of everything falling apart. And through it all, I heard that little voice in my head, "Man up, Walt, stand your ground," but the ground felt like quicksand beneath me. No matter how much I wanted to fight, I didn't know what kind of man I'd be when I did. And so I wandered back home that night, empty-handed and broken, wondering if there was anyone left who believed in me at all. I remember the day it happened like it was imprinted on my bones, how the branch of that old oak tree scratched against my window at dawn and the sky felt too still, as if the world were holding its breath. It was a Tuesday in September of 2001, just after our shop had reopened from the audit debacle, and I'd barely slept, nerves jangling like loose lug nuts. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring coffee into my favorite chipped mug, when Dennis appeared in the doorway, eyes cold and hollow, holding a stack of papers that felt like a blow to the chest. He didn't say good morning. He didn't even nod. He just placed those documents on the table, psychiatric evaluations, forged signatures, certificates of hospitalization, and watched me like I was a stranger. I remember the clock on the wall clicking over to 7:13 and feeling it stop, as though its hands were frozen in that moment of betrayal. My heart thundered so loud I thought it might tear right out of my ribcage. I reached for the papers, but my hand trembled so badly I nearly dropped the mug and spilled coffee across the floor. I looked up at Dennis, voice faint and shaking, and asked what the hell he thought he was doing. He stared back, emotionless, and said only, "It's time, Walt. You need help." In that instant, everything inside me twisted, rage, disbelief, sorrow, confusion colliding like cars in a wreck. I'd always prided myself on keeping my head when things got rough, but there on our own kitchen floor, I felt my knees buckle. I realized I'd lost more than a business or a brother's trust. I'd lost the very ground beneath me. Dennis took a step forward, clipped a handcuff to my wrist as if I were some common criminal, and said, "I'm doing this for you." And I believed him for a heartbeat, because he was my brother. The next hours blurred into a nightmare of white corridors and antiseptic smells, of nurses who wouldn't look me in the eye and locked doors that echoed with my own footsteps as I was led to a room the size of a closet. I remember the walls closing in, the buzzing lights overhead, the way my name sounded foreign when they called it out loud. I tried to explain, to plead, but they dismissed me with practiced calm, as though I were some delusional veteran they'd seen a dozen times before. In that moment, I lost every piece of myself I thought was unbreakable, my dignity, my freedom, my belief that blood meant something unassailable. I felt a fracture rip through my soul, a chasm of betrayal so deep that tears I didn't know I had rolled down my cheeks, hot and bitter. I realized then that the man I thought I knew had no intention of saving me. He intended to bury me, to carve me out of our family story so he could rewrite it as his own. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting their grid until they blurred together, and a cold resignation settled in my chest. I was trapped in a prison built from lies and forged names, and there was no one left to fight for me. When they locked the door behind me, I pressed my ear to it, half hoping someone would speak up, half dreading that silence would be my only answer. In that crushing hush, I understood I had to find my own way out of this darkness, that if I stayed silent now, I would be lost forever. And as the echoes of my brother's footsteps faded down the hallway, I made a promise to myself I would not let this be the end of my story. This was the moment my life broke, but it was also the moment I decided to fight back, to prove that the worst cages are built from broken trust, and that even the smallest spark of defiance can set a man free. It was weeks, maybe months, before I realized the world outside those hospital walls still turned, that spring eventually gave way to summer and leaves began to green again, even as I felt frozen inside. When I finally stumbled back through the front gate of my own life, I wasn't the same Walt who'd stepped into that clinic. The shop was shuttered, the paint peeling from the sign I'd nailed together with Pa, and a hush hung over the neighborhood where once laughter and engine clatter had ruled the day. I found a small room above an old laundromat, cheap rent, and a ceiling so low I felt the weight of every memory pressing me down, but at least it was mine, more mine than that place with locked doors and forced smiles. I slept in my clothes half the nights, leaving my boots by the bed, afraid that if I closed my eyes too deeply, I'd wake up behind bars again. The mirror in the bathroom reflected a man I barely recognized, cheeks hollowed, eyes shadowed, shoulders slumped as though the simple act of carrying himself upright took more effort than he had left to give. Friends I'd known since childhood drifted by with awkward nods, "Glad you're out, Walt," they'd say, never asking how much of me was gone, never offering more than a quick handshake. Mary tried to visit once, but the look in her eyes carried questions I couldn't answer, so we said little and she left with a tight hug that still stings in memory. No one spoke of Dennis. His name felt like ash on my tongue, too bitter to taste. I spent long mornings on a battered wooden chair by the window, watching the neighborhood kids chase baseballs and the mail truck trundle down the street, and wondered if I'd ever feel a part of any story again. My faith in people had splintered. I believed in simple truths, kindness, loyalty, family, but those words now echoed hollow. I caught myself flinching whenever someone knocked on my door, my heart leaping before I realized it was the landlord bringing the rent receipt. I learned to move through my days like a ghost, keeping conversations short, my voice low, so I wouldn't be asked to explain the gap in my life. I'd left behind more than a shop or a brother's betrayal. I'd left a piece of myself in those sterile halls where time stopped and logic dissolved. In the silence that followed, I began to rebuild, but the foundation was cracked, and every brick I laid felt fragile. I started taking odd jobs, moving furniture, mowing lawns, walking dogs, anything to put a few bills on the table. My hands trembled the first time I lifted a lawnmower, as if muscle memory itself had been erased, but bit by bit, I found a rhythm. Yet even as I earned my keep, I felt an emptiness gnawing at my bones, a space where trust and certainty once lived. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake listening to distant sirens and crickets, memories of fluorescent lights and locked doors crowding the dark. I'd whisper into the emptiness, "You're still here, Walt. You made it out." And in that act of speaking my own truth, I felt a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe defiance, that reminded me I hadn't been completely stripped bare. Over time, I learned to let the aches settle into a quiet companion rather than a relentless tormentor. I stopped pretending I could go back to being the man I once was. Instead, I focused on the man I needed to become. I read old war journals and poetry, found solace in words that knew suffering, and let them teach me that survival wasn't just about enduring, but about finding meaning afterward. I took in stray dogs, giving them the shelter I craved, and in their gentle eyes, I caught glimpses of the loyalty and kindness I feared lost forever. My faith in people wasn't restored overnight, but it grew in small acts of neighborly generosity, in the nod of a passing stranger, in the wag of a tail and the warmth of its fur. I realized that life after loss isn't about forgetting the pain. It's about carrying it forward as proof you're still alive and still capable of caring. And though the world had changed me, hardened me in ways I never imagined, I discovered that even broken men can rebuild themselves, discovering strength in scars and wisdom in the quiet aftermath of the storm. I can't tell you exactly what flicked that switch inside me. Maybe it was the morning I saw old Mrs. Daniels struggling with her groceries as I passed by, or the day Roy, that young orderly who'd smuggled me out of the hospital, tracked me down after all these years to drop off a stack of letters he'd kept hidden. Whatever the spark, I felt something shift in my chest, like the first tentative breaths of spring after a long, unforgiving winter. One afternoon, I found myself rolling up my sleeves to help Mrs. Daniels carry her parcels up the front steps of her tiny bungalow. Her thankful smile was everything I needed, a quiet reminder that even small deeds could stitch the frayed edges of a life back together. That simple act of kindness, of being useful again, gave me a thrill I hadn't felt since before Dennis turned our world upside down. I realized then that sheltering stray dogs and mowing lawns, while honest work, only filled my days. What I craved was purpose. So I started showing up at the community center on Tuesdays, volunteering to teach basic auto maintenance to folks who couldn't afford shop fees. The first class was a jumble, worn-out tools, a half-disassembled engine block, earnest faces staring back at me. But when a young single mom thanked me for saving her from tow truck bills, I felt an ember of hope glow inside. That night, I sat on the porch with my dog, Buddy, whose tail thumped softly against the wooden floorboards, and I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I could build something new from the ashes of the old. Around that time, I ran into Father O'Malley at the corner store, the priest who'd married Mary and me all those years ago. He clasped my shoulder, eyes full of quiet understanding, and asked if I consider speaking at the Veterans Hall about surviving trauma. My first reaction was to shake my head, me, in front of a crowd. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that sharing my story might help someone else feel less alone. So I said yes. Standing at that podium, under the dim hall lights, I cleared my throat and let the years pour out, the betrayal, the locked doors, the clawing escape, the long slog back to the man I'd almost forgotten I could be. When the applause finally came, it sounded like rain on parched earth, washing away a lifetime of doubt. It was in that moment I discovered that the wound that once threatened to consume me could become a source of strength, and that telling the truth, no matter how painful, could set others free. From then on, I let opportunities find me. I began writing letters to the local paper's community column, sharing tips on car upkeep alongside reflections on honesty and resilience. People wrote back, offering me odd jobs and sisterhood knitting groups inviting me to coffee. My trailer, once a hollow shell, felt warm again, cluttered with thank you cards and photographs of students proudly showing off their newly oiled engines. And every morning, I drift back to that first spark, The sound of Roy's knock on my door, the crinkle of Mrs. Daniels' smile, the clink of Father O'Malley's rosary beads, and I thank God for second chances. Because sometimes healing doesn't happen in grand gestures or overnight. Sometimes it begins with a single question: what can I do today to make someone else's burden lighter? And from that tiny opening, a man can find his heart beating steady once more, ready to take on whatever comes next. I stood on the edge of that old garage one crisp autumn morning, the air smelling of wood smoke and rusting metal, and I knew I was ready to let go. In my hand, I held the faded leather journal I'd carried through every twist and turn of this journey, its pages yellowed with tears and sweat, the ink smudged where my hand shook in anger and despair. I thumbed through the entries, my own voice from years gone by, each line a reminder of the nights I lay awake questioning my worth, the days I fought to prove my sanity, the moments I wondered if I'd ever see daylight again. I felt the weight of it all in my chest, a burden I'd borne like a secret wound, and I realized that carrying it any longer would only keep me chained to the past I'd already survived. I took a breath that tasted of possibility, lifted my hand, and tossed the journal into the open maw of the rusted metal drum beside me, where logs crackled and flames licked at the edges. The pages caught fire instantly, curling and blackening as the wind carried flakes of ash into the sky. I watched the flames dance, felt them burn away the last of my fear and bitterness, and I let my shoulders fall for the first time in years. In that moment, I forgave myself for every doubt I'd ever held, every tear I'd shed, every time I'd wondered if I was the only one fighting for redemption. I forgave Dennis, too, not because he deserved it, but because I refused to let his betrayal define the rest of my days. I chose to live on, without claims, without regrets, just on. I stepped back from the fire, feeling lighter, as though the sun itself had slipped into my heart. I slipped my hands into my pockets and walked down the gravel path toward my trailer, where Buddy, my old doc, rose and wagged his tail in greeting. I smiled at him, the lines on my face softening, and felt a quiet joy bloom in my chest. That day I decided to fill my life with things that mattered. Helping my neighbors, mentoring a few more kids at the community center, writing letters not of anger but of gratitude. I fixed up the garage's leaning post outside and repainted the sign, not because I planned to reopen the shop, but because I wanted that place to stand as a testament to perseverance rather than pain. I hung a new plaque above the door that read, "Walt's Workshop, open for second chances," and I meant every word. Inside, I set up camp chairs and a small table where folks could come by, share a story, or just have a cup of coffee and know they'd be heard. I learned that acceptance wasn't a destination but a decision I had to make every morning when I rose from bed, and I vowed never to let the ghost of that old betrayal haunt me again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and lavender, I sat on the front steps with Buddy at my feet, the world feeling both vast and welcoming. I allowed myself to feel pride in the man I'd become, a man who'd stared down darkness and chosen hope instead. And in the gentle hush of that evening, I whispered to the wind, "This is my life, and I will live it fully." And just like that, the past no longer had power over me. I was finally free. I've walked a long road since those days when betrayal cracked my world open, and if there's one truth I carry with me now, it's that we cannot let past hurt become the lock on our own freedom. I used to believe that life was something that simply happened to you, good fortune arriving when the time was right, kindness returning when you deserved it. But I learned the hard way that you're the only one who can set yourself free from the cages built by others. I spent years waiting for someone to acknowledge my side of the story, for the world to see me as I saw myself, only to discover that waiting was its own kind of torment. No one came until I made the first move, and that day I realized the power to change my life was never in someone else's hands. The lesson I share now isn't a platitude about faith or fate. It's a simple, hard-earned truth. If you keep a wound hidden, it festers. It demands attention. You have to bring it into the light, tell your story, fan the spark of your own voice until it becomes a flame that cannot be ignored. And when you do that, you give others permission to do the same. I discovered that helping one neighbor, teaching one kid to change a tire, sharing one honest moment in front of an audience, those acts didn't just stitch my own wounds. They created threads of connection that anchored me in a community of people who needed my truth as much as I needed theirs. I learned that a single step, no matter how small, carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It reminds you that you still matter. I found out that forgiveness isn't about absolving the one who hurt you. It's about releasing the heavy burden of bitterness so you can make room for something better. You don't have to endorse a betrayal to set yourself free from its shadow. You simply have to decide that your life's next chapter deserves your full attention. And so I hope my story can serve as a nudge for you, watching this now, feeling trapped by a past you can't undo, that maybe it's time to stop waiting, stop hoping for rescue. Maybe it's time to pick up your own pen, write your own truth, and throw it into the fire so you can watch it burn away the doubt and fear you've carried for too long. Because the worst prison isn't made of steel bars, it's the silence you keep, the belief that you're alone in your struggle, the thought that your voice doesn't matter. If you've ever felt that ache, know this. Every moment you've lasted through has forged strength in you. Every scar you bear is proof you've survived. And every step you take toward owning your story, however shaky at first, is a step toward a life more honest, more open, and more alive than the one you left behind. So don't wait for someone else to open the door. Stand up, walk toward that threshold, and push it wide. Your freedom is waiting on the other side. And so here we are at the end of a road I never meant to travel, and I find myself looking right at you across this screen, feeling a warmth in my chest that I thought I'd lost a long time ago. You've walked with me through the dust of that little shop, felt the sting of betrayal behind those locked doors, and seen me rise again from ashes I swore would bury me. But this story isn't just about the past, it's about today, about the life I'm living now, with Buddy by my side and a community that's taught me the value of a helping hand and an honest heart. I want you to feel that same warmth, that same gentle tug in your own heart, when you look at the people you love or the dreams you've tucked away on a dusty shelf. Because here's what I've learned. Life isn't measured by the years we count, but by the moments we choose to reach out, to forgive, to believe in something more than our own fears. And I'll be honest, sometimes in the quiet of the evening I sit out on my porch, watching the sun dip low and paint the sky in colors only an old soul can appreciate. And I think back to Mary, her laughter echoing through the garage, the way her hand felt in mine those early days. I wonder, does true love always find its way back? Does it remember the promise of spring after the coldest winter? I don't have an answer that fits neatly in a box, only a feeling in my bones that some things, once they take root in your heart, stay there even when the world tries to wash them away. Maybe she remembers, maybe she doesn't, but the thought of what could be still gives me hope, and I believe that hope is one of the greatest gifts we can share. So I ask you now, dear friend watching this, what do you think? Should we stop waiting for life to happen to us and start writing our own chapters, even when the ink feels shaky? Should we trust that love, in all its forms, can circle back around, healing wounds we thought were too deep to ever mend? I leave you with that question, because your answer is the one that matters most. And if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a choice, whether to forgive or to hold on, to speak up or to stay silent, remember this: you're not alone in the night, and you don't have to face the darkness by yourself. Take a step forward, push open that door, and let the world see the strength of your story. And sometimes, just sometimes, in the quiet hush before dawn, you might hear a familiar laughter carried on the breeze, reminding you that memory and love are never far behind.